Southwest of Læsø, Denmark, there's a Viking Age hall complex. Gudme, Denmark has two similar halls. West Stowe in Suffolk has a large hall. It's the largest complete hall, approximately 23 feet wide and 46 feet long. Yavering in Northumberland is the last one. And I pulled this list off the Mead Hall wiki page, so that's my research there. But take a look at it. We can't guarantee that these were used for mead halls, but comparing the archaeology to the descriptions in poems and sagas, it becomes pretty clear. So before I get into the alcohol part of this, does anybody... I got 3 people watching. Any of you got questions? I should drink some water. All right. Nobody's said anything. So let's power through. So alcohol and its consumption. So you come to the feast, you hang out with your friends, and alcohol. Tacitus in his Germania, which I did not know this, but he did not actually ever go to Germania Magna. So he's copying an earlier writing, which I feel dumb that I didn't know that before. But basically, he talks about how to spend a night or day in drinking disgraces no one. He's talking about the Germans here. Their quarrels, as might be expected with intoxicated people, are seldom fought out with mere abuse, but commonly with wounds and bloodshed. Yet it is at their feasts that they generally consult on the reconciliation of enemies, on the forming of alliances, and on the choice of chiefs. Finally, even in peace or war, for they think that no time the mind is more open to simplicity of purpose and more warm to noble aspirations than when you're drunk. So this is Tacitus writing in the 1st century about, as I said, copying somebody else's homework. And it's pretty likely that holds true through the Viking Age, through the Anglo-Saxon Age and all these. So what were they drinking at these feasts? Beer and ale. There's some really interesting discussion about whether or not beer was common in Iceland. So continental sources, Scandinavia, England, they're growing grains, makes a lot of sense. But in the sagas, in Icelandic sagas, they talk about they need to get grain shipped in all the time to make their beer. So they might not be drinking as much beer as we think they are, which raises an interesting question about what they are drinking a lot of, especially since sources like the Havamal and sagas talk about you don't want to give people water, that water is sort of a less good drink. So water's out, beer's out, mead is likely out. So my guess is they're drinking a lot of what's called musa, which is a fermented whey, because they were a dairy-heavy economy. Dairy, I don't know if any of them are lactose intolerant today, but I hope they weren't at the time. So beer and ale, Old English beor and alu or alu, Old Norse björ and öl. Interestingly, beer is what we call it almost exclusively in English. We do have ales, obviously, but the sort of generic term is beer. In Scandinavia, the generic term is ale. There's a really cool runic charm that shows up quite early that's glossed as ALU, which is ale, and found in a number of Elder Futhark inscriptions. But the individual runes represent God, a lake water, or a leak, possibly. And then the last one is an auroch, or water, and it may be a way to sort of a magical spell, so you're combining God, water, and food. And these are the things you need for life, maybe. And then that was conflated later with Proto-Germanic alu, meaning an intoxicating beverage. There's leeks, though. The argument for lagos, meaning leek, not lake. Leeks do show up quite a lot in Germanic literature, and they as a medicinal plant, or magical plant. So that's just kind of, I think that's neat. Leeks, there you go. There's a word that only appears once in Anglo-Saxon literature, Ealishwern, putting the pouring away of ale, has produced a lot of scholarly discussion on the possibility of a continuing connection between ale and luck, which I think is quite fascinating. So you all three, the ale, the beer, and then you have another one, Mungat, which shows up in Icelandic literature. All of these are malt-based beverages. Mungat appears to be the strongest beverage of the three. And ales in Egil's saga, after the ale was borne in, a beer of the strongest type was brought, and that's the translation there of Mungat. One etymology suggests a literal meaning of a tasty drink, suggesting it was mixed with additional sugars to sweeten the flavor. So beer and ale were probably fairly quick and low alcohol content. The Mungat might be a longer brew or additionally sweetened somehow. Saga evidence suggests in Scandinavia and Iceland that Öl was the default beverage, so hops were cultivated early in the Frankish territories. Pepin the Short leaves a hop garden to the cloister of Saint-Denis in 768, but the earliest reference to hops and brewing in Germany doesn't show up until 1079. So these are probably unhopped beverages. Gruit is largely argued for. It's an herb mixture including sweetgale, mugwort, yarrow, ground ivy, horehound, and Calluna heather. So that's one of the arguments that I've seen as an additive to the brewing process to flavor the brew in Scandinavia prior to hops being introduced. Sahti, a Finnish beverage, is also sometimes referenced as Viking Age beer, and it's a wild. Somebody's gonna have to correct me on this one, but if I remember correctly, it's a wild yeast beverage. So it makes sense that it'd be argued for Viking Age, but it's sometimes spiced with juniper berries and twigs. I hate juniper. Mead is the next common. That's the one that we commonly in our minds connect with feasting. It's probably a celebratory beverage. It shows up as sort of the high status drink. It shows up in stories about the gods. It shows up, you like the king might have mead. It's not necessarily a beverage that's going to be just sort of quaffed everywhere. Difficulty of producing mead elevated its status. Rodriguez, he wrote a fantastic, it's old Norse drinking culture, it's fantastic thesis. I've got a link to it in my sources. Quotes Hornsey and suggests that mead was honestly kind of an outdated drink by the time of the sagas, that it was not, it wasn't popular. It was sort of that's what they drank back in the day. And you might roll it out for fancy occasions, but it just wasn't. It had lost its pep. Wolfstan and Egil's saga both suggest that mead was more abundant in the east than in Norway or Iceland. So Sweden, possibly Denmark, the lands of the Rus. None of them really talk about mead in Scandinavia or in England. Mead shows up obviously in the poetry of England, but I'm not sure that it shows up as much in sort of general food ways. Wine is sort of supplanting mead as the prestige drink. It's being produced possibly in England. There's a lot of debate about that, or there's some debate about that at least. It's not being produced in Scandinavia, but they're importing it from the Frankish territories, and it's sort of it's the nice stuff because we have to get it from outside, right? It's like wine is today, right? Well, I guess we do produce it here, but not in Alaska. There's a really neat concept called the wine frontier, which is a line across England or across Europe, but Google that. So other alcoholic beverages, lacto fermentation. That's what we're talking about with making the alcohol out of the whey. Sura, probably guessing what they drink a lot of in Iceland. It's very acidic, probably mixed 11 parts water to 1 part of the whey. It doesn't seem to be particularly well thought of to drink straight. It sounds disgusting, frankly, but we're going to try making it. Not on this video, though. It's used to protect people from fire sometimes, rather than drinking it. So you might toss it on a fire. Don't drink the stuff. So those are the alcoholic beverages that at least I'm aware of. If you've got more information, I'd love to hear it. Alcoholic consumption was intrinsically linked to ceremony and celebration. So there's the concept of the bride ale. where which sticks around interestingly in England for quite a long time. There's a reference in 1572 to they had to create a law that said that no person shall brew any wedding ale that shall not brew above 12 strike of malt, so it's enough for basically 2 barrels or 576 pints of strong ale. At the most, that the said person so married shall not keep nor have above 8 mess of person at his dinner. At the mess was 4 people. So you're allowed to have 32 diners. And if you're going to have these 32 diners, you cannot brew more than 576 pints. So that's 18 pints per person for your bridal ale. Then funeral ales, you have a similar, so you celebrate your wedding with ale, you celebrate a funeral with ale. And there's a really interesting Norse custom combined with drinking where you would get, so at the funeral feast, before you were allowed to take up, especially we're talking high status individuals, before you were allowed to take the seat, the person inheriting the high seat, before they were allowed to take that seat, they had to drink the we're not there in the notes, but we're going to go there anyway. You had to drink your bragiful. You had to drink your bragiful. You made a toast. You made a boast. You know, I'm going to expand my father's territory by double, or I'm going to marry the most beautiful woman in the country, or I am going to go to war this winter again, or this summer against so and so. So you toasted the dead, you drank your boast, and then and only then were you allowed to take your seat, the seat of the person you were inheriting from. I don't think they really got in for primogenitor, but they did practice to some extent ultimogenitor, which is inheritance by the youngest. So whoever was inheriting, you had to do these steps involving alcohol with a cup of alcohol, and consuming it before you were allowed to take your seat. So the first stage of so there's quite a lot about weddings in this handout that I just skipped right over. I apologize, but feel free to go back and take a look at that. And we sort of skipped over neighbor ales. A neighbor ale is when you, especially around Yule time, everybody would get together, combine resources, brew a beer, share it out among everyone, and sort of feast and celebrate that. So that's the neighbor ale. That one shows up actually in the laws of the Gulta thing, which is kind of neat. A very early law code. Funeral ale, we talked about the funeral ale. The Erfi was the feast at which you did this drinking. There's a lot of very good resources for this, especially in the sagas coming out of Norway, the king's sagas, because this is, kings inherit, like as sons inherited from their father, the king, you had to fulfill these rites and practices. Sorry, I just blew through 5 pages in one go. There's lots of very interesting examples from the sagas in here if you go through it. So Yule, really quick linguistic aside, so Yule in Old English Yule, or in Old Norse Yule, both come from the Proto-Germanic, which I can't pronounce, which means Yule or festivities. It does not come from Odin, the name of Odin, a type of cod, the word ale, the Latin Ioculus, or the name Julius Caesar. I have seen Yule, the word we're looking here is folk etymologies. I have seen folk etymologies for Yule that rely on all of these. None of those are correct. It's from an Old Norse, a Proto-Germanic word that means a party, or Yule. So the Yule feasts, Hakon the Good saga talks about he moved the Yule celebrations, the traditional Yule celebrations, to coincide with Christmas. So I guess that wasn't Constantine at the whatever. But there's some specific regulations about what needed to be celebrated, and that you should hold a feast. Everyone should hold a feast with malted beer, or you had to pay with cattle. And you were supposed to keep the time holy while enjoying your beer. So we talked about the bragaful when you made at the funeral feast. You could also have a bragaful promise cup at other occasions. Sometimes it's part of a drinking game where everybody would go around the room making these boasts, and everybody was supposed to sort of out boasting each other. Or you might do it as part of a religious ritual, or just while you were drinking. A Mimi, or the Mimney, was drunk to the memory of dead friends. There's also some sort of religious aspects that get tied up with that. There's some examples where they talk about you drank the Mimi to the gods, to various gods in turn, and then you drank it to the dead friends or just the gods. And then after the coming of Christianity, those gods were replaced with the Christ, the saints, the Archangel Michael, the Virgin Mary, and St. Olaf, which I think is quite interesting that St. Olaf gets his own special call out. Though I guess in Norway, I shouldn't be surprised. So you have your sort of ritual, solemn boasting. You could also have sort of a jesting boast. These are the things, but basically alcohol, I will do the thing, you drink. Drunkenness, you weren't supposed to get drunk. Please do not get drunk at my feast in November, if we hold it. We're going to hold it. It's going to be awesome. Don't get drunk at the feast in November. I'm really excited that there's only 2 people watching this, because that makes the anxiety less. You were supposed to have fun, and you were supposed to sort of loosen your tongue, but you were not supposed to get sloppy. An anthropologist, last note there, was an anthropologist might point out the connection between sort of fertility of the field, of the grain, into the alcohol, into the people, but I'm not an anthropologist, so I won't go there. So the next section talks about games and fun and activities that happened at the feast. I'm going to take a quick break and get some water. If anybody's got questions, let me know. And by take a break, I mean sit here in front of a camera and drink my water. I think in the future this class is going to get broken up, because we're at 41 minutes and page 14 of... Well, there's 39 pages of text before we get into the... So, thank you both for hanging with me through this. I appreciate it. All right, so games and entertainment. The biggest one was, it translates directly as a man evening, which I think is fantastic. Basically, you were supposed to sort of drink, and it's a game of comparison. So you're comparing either living men at the feast, living men in the area, or dead men. And you could, like, I'm such a good whatever, that person's dumb. And you could either build it as... I'm so cool, and it did go by really fast theory, yes, and oh man, okay. So you could either use it to build up other people, or to sort of be an asshole and be like, I'm so cool, that person's terrible. So the game appears, at least in the sagas, to be very ritualized. Something to keep in mind is that, especially with these written sources, because they were sometimes remembered or passed on like that, you're going to have very formulaic events that are either shared between sagas, or the formula repeats in similar ways across different sagas. So while it appears formulaic in the sagas, it may not, or ritualized in the sagas, it may not have actually played out this way. That just may be the tool for remembering. So to a certain extent, they appear to follow this pattern. You have the initial calling out. So in Burnt Njál's saga, Snorri proclaims, "Who is that man, 5th in line, the pale, sharp-featured man with a smirk on his face and an axe on his shoulder?" And that person responds, "My name is Hæthun," he said, "but some call me Skarphæthun in full. Have you anything else to say to me?" So it's worth keeping in mind here, Snorri already knows Hæthun's name. He knows who he is. This is just an opportunity. This is a softball kind of question. Who are you? And then you get the chance to say, well, I am. So who are you? And he says, my name is Hæthun, but some call me Skarphæthun. Do you have anything else to say? Then once you've made this claim who you are, the other person might make a claim back, and then you have sort of claim, defense, and counterclaim. So from Morkinskinna, King Sigurdur proclaimed, "I believe, King Eystein, that I am stronger and a better swimmer." King Eystein said, "That's true, but I am more skilled and better at board games, and that's worth as much as your strength." So Sigurdur here, Sigurdur's claim is, "I'm the better swimmer." And Eystein says, "Yeah, you're the better swimmer, but I'm smarter than you. So you're strong, I'm smart." Uh, which it's worth keeping in mind here. These two are brothers, and they're sort of co-ruling, and it's not going well at this point in the saga. So that's where this fighting is coming from. So sometimes you'll see in the responses, you'll see parallels. So again, this is from Magnus the Saga of the Sons of Magnus. Then asked King Sigurdur, "Do you remember that I was always able to throw you when we wrestled, although you were a year older?" And then Eystein said, "Rather, I remember that you were not so good at the games, which require agility. So do you remember?" "No, I remember this." And so you'll see that, like, the verbs get copied down. Again, Othvar's Otter Saga. "Odd, were you not on Astafel when we won Shining Gold? The berserkers, we bound them. There was a champion, the king of the king's host, slain." Odd responds, "Siolf, were you not there when we watched the mail coats washing in blood, spear points explored in the ring mail? Would you while you would rather get to know the king's hall?" So in here the formula is, were you not were you not there when? And so, weren't you there when we had this great time? No, you were back home being boring. So that's another version of that, making a claim, responding to the claim. The Orvar Otter Saga, you also have these repetitive lines. So those people will remember that King Eystein was in Norway. So the Oddvar Og Saga has the repeated lines of, "You were there when, weren't you there when?" And then another example is the Morkinskinna repeats the phrase, "Those people remember that King Eystein was in Norway." So in this case, Sigurdur in Morkinskinna, Sigurdur has gone off on crusade, essentially, and left his brother Eystein home. And Eystein is like, "Well, you might have had this great time, but everybody will remember that I was the one here doing the actual job." And then there's drinking. Each round involved one contender handing a beer-filled horn to his opponent, or beer-filled beverage holder to his opponent, directing to him either a boast or an insult, and the opponent then drinks the horn and repeats the process. So we have our beverage-filled container. I might pass it to Cass and say, "Cass, you're very good at the weaving, but your shoes are sloppy." And then Cass would take a drink and pass it back to me and say, "You don't even make shoes, so shut up," or something to that, something like that. There was going to be a point in the original class where at this point you would all get to try and insult me and watch it bounce off, but clearly that didn't happen. So when you're playing this game, things that you can boast about in yourself or insult in others, their physicality, so strength, skill at arms, bravery, feats of extra normal skill. So in one case, somebody boasts about being able to jump over a river. I don't think in the saga they actually follow through on that. Like, then he has to prove that he can jump over the river, but maybe it does. So another option is social duties. This can include public speaking, handling